Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Traver. If you're brand new, this is Gary. Gary is a long-term Jesus follower, Torah observer, and nothing legalistic about this guy. He just, by the Spirit, he and his wife have been an inspiration to me. We're covering Yeshua and the Melchizedekian kingdom. Our high priest, Yeshua, is in the order of Melchizedek. We've spent now 10 podcasts covering what that means. And today we're finally bridging that gap into the New Testament. And Gary, I got to say, I think, sometimes, you can read Psalm 110 or read Hebrews 7, and you think to yourself, I could probably get this wrapped up in 3 or 4 hours, unless you're a scholar. But, even for you scratching the surface, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, there is. You're right. Yeah. In some ways, it just, as we've mentioned, I think on a number of occasions, this teaching actually is inside of almost every book of the Bible at some level,
Yeah.
And it's definitely more intensely discussed in the Old Testament than most people realize. Because, if you look at, go look it up in a concordance and find out where Melchizedek is spoken of, and you see a handful of places, right? But no.
Well, what I think I've seen from you is that, in the same way the tabernacle and Yahweh's laws, these are shadows of a grander picture.
Yes.
What I'm seeing now is the Melchizedekian priesthood is that same thing.
Yes,
it is the goal. It is the substance of all that we are aiming toward.
That's right. That's a very good way to put it. I believe that. I believe it is the substance of what the shadows point to.
Yeah.
And of course, as we talked about last time and a few other times, the Levitical priesthood doesn't go away, at least not until the New Jerusalem. But it definitely has, a somewhat different role. It's important for what God is doing, as we discussed in relationship specifically to the Ezekiel's temple last time. But really, if you're thinking about eternity, the Melchizedekian priesthood has a lot more to say, frankly.
Yeah.
Than the Levitical priesthood about eternity. And so that's why it's, I think, of great significance to us.
Okay, so what's the trajectory for today? And
today is the bridging. And what I wanted to do is give the members of your audience maybe a perspective on the New Testament that will help them to understand it better. And in fact, I think it can be quite revelatory. Because I believe that, I know for myself, kind of going through teaching the scriptures for the last 40 years, I have gradually come to this understanding about the New Testament that has been immensely useful to me and particularly helpful to this topic. And so I would like to kind of go through that and answer a central question. And in the process of answering this question, in reality, what we'll do is we'll make that bridge from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and we'll set the stage for our final discussions in these next several podcasts for the New Testament. And that question is, why has this subject, why have these ideas about Melchizedek and about the Melchizedek priesthood not been more readily recognized by most believers? It's either absent to their consciousness, or if it's there at all, it's this sort of big mystery, It's like
it's
something
spooky.
they don't understand, It's kind of out of nowhere, What is that? What is with that? When you think about it, and of course now, if your viewers have been following, these last 10 or so podcasts that we've done. Hopefully what they're understanding is, my gosh, there's a lot in here about this. It's almost staggering how much is tied into this idea, and yet it's just so noticeably absent. And I believe that it has a lot to do with the fact that most believers confine their sole Bible study, if they're doing any Bible study at all, in the New Testament. And this is problematic, it turns out. This is not what God had intended, The New Testament is important. And in fact, I think as we understand the role of the New Testament better, what why God had it written, why God brought it into being, we can get a better insight as to, this is why I don't understand it, because to understand it, you have to go all the way back to the book of Genesis. You can't ignore the Old Testament. It's impossible. I
just had a friend who read the whole Bible in 1 month.
Oh, wow.
1 month or 2 months? 1 or 2 months, either way, real fast.
That's a challenge. 30 days, you're not doing much else. I tell you that much.
Well, it was 2 hours a day, solid dedication. Yeah. And what he said was one of the number one things that he learned was that when you're reading the Bible linearly all the way through, anytime you're reading a particular book, that it's almost as if the author of the book assumes that what happened beforehand.
Exactly. That is exactly. That's one of my major messages. In fact, so that experience, and I know he got a lot out of it. There's no question. In fact, actually, reading fast, there's value to that at times. There's a certain thing that you garner from that you can't get if you just plod through. So, and that message, that's one of the most single important things that he could have learned, I think, from his exercise. And it has a lot to do with what I want to share about the New Testament. Is that when the New Testament was written, it was never intended to be a standalone document. It never was. Everything, Jesus' teachings, the apostles' teachings, the things that happen are recorded historically, and we see how the new believers in this faith, how they respond and how they try to work things through. It's all in reference back to the writings, the traditions of the Old Testament, all of it. And this is why to me, the people that try to make these like two separate documents, to me, that's an exercise in ultimate futility. You just can't do it. You can't be intellectually honest, truly, and do that, in my judgment. You really can't. You
can. And I think, Gary, there is a glut of knowledge. Glut. Does that mean a lot?
Yeah. That's not a bad term. Glut. It's almost overwhelming, right? It's kind of like a.
Well, what I found with folks is that you have a lot of people in the pastorate who have learned this saved by grace doctrine, and most of their theology is a New Testament theology to the exclusion of the Old Testament. Yes. Because that's true. When they get to Hebrews and start to want to talk about the Levitical priesthood, what was kind of sort of maybe changed in Hebrews 7. Here's the truth. They don't know.
No, they don't.
So what they do is they kind of pass through it really quickly.
Yeah.
And they don't understand the theological import.
Correct.
And
That's
they proliferate with this kind of you talk about a watered down gospel. That's what watered down means.
That's right. It means
is when you try to preach without the substantive knowledge of the Old Testament.
That's
and
right.
It happens all the time.
Yes, that's right. In fact, and I might have mentioned this before, we have a well-known pastor of a large church here in the Sacramento metropolitan area, and he did a series on Hebrews, and he opened it with, "The book of Hebrews scares me." Can you imagine? And I'm going to be going through this, learning it with you. That's what he said. And he spent months covering the book. Now, can you imagine if I'm a parishioner in a church like that, and I hear that from the pastor, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what does he have to share? What does he have to impart about the book of Hebrews if you start your series off that way?
Well,
the book of Hebrews doesn't scare me at all. In fact, it's a wondrous book.
Because it's a marvel. It's explanatory to you.
Yeah.
It fills in some gaps. It helps you understand where the trajectory is going.
Yes,
but
that's
for
right.
the average parishioner, what they're thinking is, as long as you are doing something in such a way that's relatively short and somewhat entertaining and speaks to my life today, and I can get out the door and get the Taco Bell, I'm good.
Yeah. That's about right. Taco Bell.
Saying.
Maybe In-N-Out Burger. I don't know. I see a lot of people there on Sundays.
It's true.
So I know. And then this is a concept that I just would like to impart. And one of the things about about the New Testament is obviously, and we've talked already about it being a document strongly linked, and as a result, when the New Testament was written, and whether this was thought through by the writers or whether it was just inspired by the Holy Spirit or both, they were, I think, aware that they were building on this foundation. See? So when you're writing something and you're building on a foundation as opposed to really writing something that's brand new, it has a whole different perspective. Your vocabulary changes, how you organize things changes. It's just a very different form of writing. And one thing that is not appreciated, I think, by a lot of people is that we tend to think of, the people in the first century and these religious Jews and, Jesus' apostles, who were they? They were fishermen and people in the trades largely and, not quote unquote educated people, that's our view of them. But in fact, I think this is a rather faulty view, that what I've learned about Jewish society in the first century is it was a highly literate society. People knew probably several languages. This was probably very common. They knew the scriptures very, very well. By the way, the first century, it was a period of great devoutness, if you will, among the people. Most people would argue that the vast majority of Jews in the first century, Judea, Galilee, Samaria, those areas, were very interested in religious and very devout. And for the men, literacy was very high. It was probably among the highest averaged over the population, maybe in the Roman Empire. That you could probably make a case for that. Why? Because individuals were expected every week, periodically, to go up and read from the Torah and to read from the scriptures. So, and then for women, there would have been probably a literacy gap. We're not sure to what extent, but certainly the women in that society were also likewise very interested in the scriptures. They were very involved, and there was probably a higher literacy rate among women than in most other societies of that period as a result. Certainly the women who are of higher standing and status in the society, almost certainly they were literate. And this was true in Roman society as well, that literacy actually was probably a little lower because Rome had so many slaves in their population, and who knows, where these people were drawn, what knowledge they would have had or literary capabilities. But it's interesting to me that Luke, in that book of Acts in several places, will say this. Pardon me. He says, and there were women of high standing who came to faith. He says this several times in the book of Acts, and you look at that and you go, now why is he telling us this? Who cares, Right. Well, but it turns out he was indicating that yes, Roman society, particularly at the higher levels of status, you were people in the aristocracy, people who would have been in high level business trades, this kind of thing. These people were very literate, and in fact, in Roman society, their education was really quite sophisticated. In some ways, it might have been even a little broader than the average Jewish person would have gotten in their form of education.
Yeah, so Luke is basically saying, hey, these are not pushover ladies. Yeah. These are savvy, well-read ladies that are making a intelligent decision based on the evidence.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, we're not dealing with country bumpkins here,
Right.
Hillbillies out the hills or something. No, not even the fishermen would have fit that category. Fishermen were businessmen. They had actually a thriving business on the Sea of Galilee, and they interacted with people from many different cultures. So I think it's important to start off realizing that these people were literate and they knew the Word of God really well. So much better than the average believer today knows even their New Testament.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, this is the condition of the people. So when the authors are writing the New Testament, that's the audience they're writing to. That's who they're appealing to. And so when we get that, we begin to understand, we should be seeing the New Testament in a very different light, you know. And as you pointed out earlier, it's actually not trying to relay old foundations over and over again, you know, and give us a new version of it. No, it's kind of like, I like to call it the capstone of the Scriptures. Mm-hmm. It's the very thing we're putting on the top of the building that completes the building.
Yeah.
And this capstone is largely focused on the cornerstone, the stone that lays the foundation for the building.
Right.
Yeah. So in essence, it's the capstone about the cornerstone.
That's what I see.
Yeah. That's what it is. And if a person understands that, if they come to the place where they really realize, oh, you mean the New Testament doesn't have to regurgitate all this information from the past. It doesn't always have to tell us, oh, this is still relevant. This is still important, you know, explicitly, you know, in the words, you know, before I'm going to do anything about it, you know. No, it doesn't, because it's making reference back to things that have already established this.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And I think a lot of false doctrine has crept into the body of Messiah because people don't understand this point.
Oh, certainly. And it is frustrating on my part is that people, you know, I teach at a seminary, as you know, and of course they're talking about the capstone, cornerstone. And I just want to say, yeah, right. Yeah, good. But we're not always talking about what the New Testament is about, is that Paul, James, John, Luke are properly setting the capstone, cornerstone in its place among the foundation, among the other things, so that those that couldn't see it could see it, but those that could see it could rightly fit the king and the nature of that king within the broader framework of the kingdom.
Yes, that's correct. And you know, it's interesting you mention that, because it does highlight, I think, that the audience is so critical, because the arguments in the New Testament, so much of it is geared to persuading the Jewish intellectual scholars. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it really is. It really is. In other words, they're going back to their own people saying, guys, get on board. God is doing something here, and he's revealed it in the past. You're not getting it. You're not understanding it. Let us make the argument for you from the Scriptures, from the thing that you most value. See, that's the New Testament. And for us Gentiles, it's, well, we can just jump in and we can learn and we can get up to speed. Yeah, we may have come from backgrounds where we don't know a whole lot about the Old Testament Scriptures, but you know what? You can get that knowledge, and you can, in a few years of diligent work, get to a place where your familiarity with the Old Testament is such that you'll be right there with your Jewish brethren. You know? And I think that's what happened in the first century. I mean, think about Paul's epistles, for goodness sakes. This man is writing stuff that is so deep and complex, and he expects to have it just read in the church, and people would understand what's going on, and this church is filled mostly with Gentiles. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And they would have to go back, and get out those Torah scrolls and those other scrolls in their local synagogue and start reading and start understanding and assimilating these concepts and ideas. And so this is the thing that I believe, if we could get to a place where we understood that, if really understood it, really saw the New Testament in its context, the audience, who the authors were, how were they writing to reach that audience in their day, we would have a different view of a lot of things. And I believe a lot of things that have seemed puzzling and mysterious and difficult to believers would become crystal clear like that.
That is my experience. Hey, if you're a brand new Bible reader, a novice reader, as you're reading through the New Testament, notice that Paul, James, they're always making arguments by quoting Old Testament texts.
That's right.
And when you see that little cross-reference in your Bibles, it's taking you back to the text in the Old Testament that sometimes it's explicit, where they actually write the text. Like at the end of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer is going to talk about the new covenant language out of Jeremiah. It's explicit. It's like rewritten. But then sometimes it's an allusion, and then you'll see a cross reference, and you can go back and begin to what Jacob and I would call hyperlinks. They're
Hyperlinks.
In other words, they're not making this stuff up, people.
No, they're
pulling
not. That's
right from the foundation, and further explaining how Jesus and his kingdom are exactly what all the Old Testament is pointing to.
That's
correct. It doesn't negate the covenants. That doesn't negate the Old Testament. The covenants are still there, but it's crazy to try to read the New Testament in isolation. You just can't do it.
You can't do it. That's right. Yeah, that's well said too. I liked how you put that. And it's really what we're up against is to try to encourage that process. And I'm convinced if most people would do what your friend did, we'd have a different church. We'd have a completely different church.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. See, this is the thing that I want to encourage people is you need to dig in, and you need to dig in for yourself. I mean, hopefully people like you and I and others who've been trailblazing this path for some time, we can give assistance, we can help, but ultimately they have to do the work. They have to own it. And if they will, we're going to see change. We're going to see amazing change. And I'm actually a little bit encouraged that in some places in the world, I don't see it so much in the United States yet, but interestingly, England, Europe, there's some things rumbling down there in the, where you're getting the sense that people are beginning to realize, we've come to an end of our period of church as we've known it. And God is really calling something else right now. Yeah. And so that encourages me. And of course, in the rest of the world, in some of the areas in Africa and Asia, we also see similar things happening where people are looking for a very different experience. And so I hope that our subject is really timely in this regard, that knowing its importance and what it can mean to imparting a kind of a new vision of a new reality for the believer in a community which is on a mission that God has given it. This is what's desperately needed now. Believers are going to have to go outside of themselves. They're going to have to raise their vision, as we've talked about several times here, and see the bigger picture of what God is doing in the world and want to be a part of that vision. That's where we are now.
Amen.
And I trust that that's what we'll be doing. And here, the second part of my discussion today, it comes into play, I think, is when we look into the New Testament and we see kind of how the New Testament unfolds, what the story is, what is happening, and what was the response of the writings to what was happening, and get more of a somewhat chronological view of things. This also helps to bring, I think, understanding about the place of the teaching that we're doing within the New Testament framework and what it means for us going forward. And I trust it will give that, we'll be able to impart some of that today. So I sort of mused and started thinking about, when we look at the New Testament, we see that in the early period, the first couple of decades, the 30s and 40s, and I'll just reference it to 30. I believe the crucifixion was right around 30 AD, plus or minus a year, something like that. And the Jerusalem Council was the same, about 50 AD. Plus or minus, not more probably minus than plus, but 50 is probably about the latest it could have been.
Okay.
But you have that 20-year period there, and when you look at the writings and the things that are revealed about that period in the writings, both things, what you see largely is really a church community that is just trying to cope with one of the most profound events of history, right? That's what you see. The crucifixion and resurrection of Messiah, that was really profound, and we forget this. We lose sight of this because, Western civilization has been built on this for the last 2 millennia. Mm-hmm. And although in this generation, it's slipping away. But for 2,000 years, we've been conscious of this. This event has been in the background, if not in the foreground, of the consciousness of the development of Western civilization. So for us, this is old news. It's almost become hackneyed. So we don't understand that to the Jewish believers, especially the Jewish believers who were anticipating the Messiah, and the Messiah they were anticipating was a very different kind of Messiah than the one they got.
Yeah.
I mean, and for him to be killed, for him to be rejected, despised, this was incomprehensible to most Jewish people. And now you're trying to convince me that he was the guy? He was the man? Right. And so there was this emphasis, and understandably so, on the staggering importance of this event and what it really meant, the interpretation, if you will. And of course, it starts here in this early period, and it gets developed further, particularly by Paul and others later. But it's very clear at the very beginning that the testimony of the early church was really focused on persuading their brethren, the greater Jewish society, that truly Jesus, Yeshua, was the Messiah. It's just that he didn't come like you were expecting. So sit down, brother, and let us explain this to you. Let us show you from the Scripture that this was expected, that this was anticipated. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the ministry of the early apostles in their work in this time are on such matters. They're dealing with the basic gospel message. And yes, they talked about the kingdom of God as well. I mean, the last question they asked Yeshua is, when are you bringing the kingdom to Israel? It's their last question that we have recorded. And he says, well, it's not for you to know the time and the seasons. So he's not discounting the question. The question is quite important, but he's saying, that's not for you to know now. There will come a time when you will understand that. But the reality of the kingdom, both in the present as well as in the future, was part of that gospel message as well. And so a lot of the emphasis in this early period is on those matters. They have to form a community. They have to establish order and authority. All of these things. They have to understand, well, how do we bring this message to others? Evangelism, what is the proper form of evangelism to take place? And by the way, the evangelical church, I don't think, comprehends this. They don't understand how evangelism is to be done. They maybe did at one time, but it's been lost.
Yeah.
It's completely been lost. How to form a community. What is the meaning of community? What's the importance of the community? A lot of that, fortunately, the Jewish people, because of their traditions and heritage, they had a basic understanding of all of these things. They really did. And for that reason, many of the forms and structures of them were just brought right over into the New Testament communities, but they were refreshed. They were given new vitality and a new kind of authority base. Obviously, the authority was going to rest now on apostles and those called by them, not on Jewish authorities, for instance. But this was the process, and it took time. This doesn't happen instantly, And these people, even during this early period, came under a form of persecution, as is detailed by the man, Apostle Paul, for one. And in this period that was meant to kind of galvanize this community. So we had this early period, and in this early period, we don't find, a lot of discussion of Melchizedek, but we do find a couple of things that are of note that I'll just point out to you in passing because it sets a foundation. And it's a foundation based on Psalm 110. So now we get to come back to Psalm 110, and we talked a lot about Psalm 110 in our early podcasts, and only done a little bit with it since. Now it becomes important because Psalm 110 is kind of that passage. It's much like what you said just a moment ago, by the way. You know how people could make allusions or references to something, and they would. Psalm 110 is like this. I mean, Jesus quotes it in reference to himself.
Right.
And this is recorded in all of the synoptic gospels. Matthew. So I have the references here. I'll just give you the chapter. You can find it easy enough. Matthew 22, Mark 12, and Luke 20. So it's in all of the same. And so he gives the people explicit identification marker, but how he does it, he doesn't mention the word Melchizedek. He doesn't have to. Because he just quotes the first part of the psalm, and guess what? The common response of a person hearing this in that day was, when I hear the first verse of something or the first passage, I look at the entire passage. It's a reference point. It's not just a declarative statement of and by itself. And see, too many Christians have this idea. Oh, he just quotes the first two verses like, oh, that's the only thing that matters. And that, no, you're missing the point if you believe that. No, he quotes the first two verses because it leads to a whole discussion.
Yeah,
and
a lot of people
of that time probably knew Psalm 110 by heart and could have spoken it back to him,
When they set up those Torah portions, and I talk about that, is they are called by the first few words of the text. So
That's right.
You and I will say, hey, turn to Genesis 1:1. They're not saying that. They're saying Bereshit. They're saying, hey, we've got this covenant happening, this in the beginning happening.
Yes.
So they heard those words, and it was this kind of this marker of, hey, put your mind at this marker, and what I'm about to say is a commentary on all that passage.
That's
and they
exactly
knew it.
right. That's right. That's exactly right. See, and that's an idea that is very foreign, unfortunately, to the modern believer. It's very foreign. They don't understand. They're reading it like, well, this verse says, and it doesn't say anymore. I think, oh, yes, it does.
Yeah.
It's just not there. You have to go to another part of the book to get the more.
Yeah.
So, and in Psalm 110 also, Peter quotes it in his very first sermon on the day of Pentecost. Now think about this. And you know what's interesting? He quotes it, and the crowd gets it. He doesn't even quote the whole thing, although he quotes a little more of it than is quoted by Yeshua himself. He, adds to it a little bit. And but the crowd gets it. That sermon caused 3,000 people to get baptized instantly. Now think about that. See, the consciousness was there, is what I'm saying. The consciousness was there, so that when these things were spoken, a few lines, but the impact is much greater than just a few lines of text. People responded because, yes, I know what you're saying. I believe it. They understood it at a deep level. So, and it tells us something else, that at the very beginning of the church in Acts, we see that this identification of Yeshua as the Melchizedek, where Melchizedek was the type of the antitype, was understood. And its linkage to the Davidic dynasty was understood. That's where Peter comes in. Peter makes more of that than even Yeshua did in his address. And so this is the foundation. So the foundation is laid. It's right there, right from the very first day of the church, if you will. And a lot of people regard the day of Pentecost, right, as the beginning of the church. Well, guess what happened at the beginning? We should pay attention to beginnings, because beginnings are important. This is taught, and it's understood, and it's readily understood by the audience. Then we come to the 40s through the 60s, and there's a little overlap in my chronology here, because the 40s introduces now another period in the history of the church, in its formation, that's of great significance. It's about sometime, we believe, in about the early 40s or so, when Cornelius and his family are called. And Cornelius is often regarded as the first Gentile, the convert, and certainly it was an important transition point, an important time in the history of the church. Whether he was the very first Gentile convert, I can't say, but he was certainly the first one that's we have any real knowledge about, in this period. And God sealed this with the coming of his Spirit, just as he had sent it on the day of Pentecost. So that also is of significance, right? Because it's saying something. That really saying something very powerful. And Peter recognized this when he relayed this subject and the incident to his fellow Jewish believers. And they got it. They understood, wow, that's significant. And so we see at the point here now a transition where it's not just a religion, Christianity, that concerns Jewish people alone, but it's offered to the Gentiles. And in reality, as New Testament authors would develop this subject further in the New Testament, particularly Paul, it became very clear that this was always in the mind of God. In fact, God has always had a plan for the Gentile, and there were a few Gentiles, even in the Old Testament, that embraced the faith. But now there was going to be a transition to something much greater. The Gentile was going to play a big role in what God was doing in the future. And so in some ways, the Jewish believers at the time, they had to kind of respond to that. Okay, well, what do you mean? The Gentiles well, these are foreigners. These are guys outside the covenants and the promises. And what do you mean they're going to play a big role? Yet, remarkably, during this period, one of the things we see as time went on, especially after the Jerusalem Council, and the apostles are talking and reporting about the gospel going to the Gentiles and the impact that that is having on the Gentiles and what is happening to Gentiles coming to faith. Do you know the response of the Jewish believers almost uniformly, at least as it's recorded in Acts, is joy, just praising God.
Yeah.
They were excited about this. Contrary, unfortunately, to the Jewish believers of the 21st century.
Yeah.
And this is sad.
Yeah.
This is really sad, and God is going to have to deal with some members of this community to wake them up because they don't realize, their brethren 20 centuries ago, they got the significance of this. They understood it. They understood it in relationship to themselves and ultimately to the kingdom itself. And it's time for people to lose their complete identification with an ethnic group, with traditions and this kind of thing. Not that that's necessarily wrong, but it can be used in a wrong way, and it can be an obstacle to going forth in the power and the might that God had intended. And that power and might includes Jew and Gentile being one in Messiah. And anything less than that is a disgrace.
Yeah.
It's a disgrace to the name of Jesus. It's an assault against the cross itself. And it's time that people wake up and stop with this nonsense. So that's my sermon.
Well, I know the force of what you're saying. There might be some people listening going, I'm not really sure. He's this pretty emphatic on his part, but there's a reason you're emphatic.
Yeah, there is.
Because there is a separation that has happened in.
That has happened. Yeah.
I don't like labeling it, but if we just say Hebrew roots movement, there's a separation that has happened in some streams of that.
Yes.
And it's a problem, big problem.
It is a big problem.
Yeah.
And it needs to be acknowledged, and let's get on board and get something done about it. And it's a matter of hearts just saying, look, it's not about my agenda. It's not about my belief system. It's about the biblical belief system and God's agenda. And we're either on board with that or we're in trouble.
Yeah.
So and if we get on board with that, I am convinced that we will see amazing things happen. Things that we wouldn't have even believed were possible. So this transitionary period, and we find during this time, we get into some of the early writings of Paul, some of his early epistles during this period especially, and I will talk about some of the later ones in a moment. But what's Paul concerned with? Well, now he's got all these Gentiles coming to faith, and they were coming in, let's put it this way, large enough numbers, even initially, that something had to be done. I mean, you had to do some organizing. You had to get congregations established, get leadership of congregations established, and make sure that these new Gentiles were properly equipped and fed. And many, fortunately, of the Gentiles who initially embraced the faith, particularly I think in the late 40s and early 50s, were from the ranks of the synagogues. They'd already been attending synagogue. They were known as the God-fearers. They were Gentiles who saw something special in Judaism that they couldn't find in pagan religions, and they decided, I want to find out more about this Jewish religion. And they would faithfully attend synagogue week after week after week. We see this in the book of Acts all the time, right? Everywhere you look, there's Gentiles in synagogues learning, and they're in synagogues on Shabbat learning the Word of God, read from the Holy Scriptures, from the scrolls themselves in those synagogues. That was how they were hearing it. And so when Paul and Barnabas, and later Paul himself, comes into a community, you see, where does he go first? The synagogues.
Yeah.
Was that for the Jews? Yes. To the Jew first, he said in Romans, right? But there were also Gentiles attending those same synagogues,
right,
and they were hearing those same words. And so Paul is in the church is now assimilating. They're working on that Jew and Gentile is one concept. What that means, working it out, trying to understand how do we bring these two disparate people groups together into one people of God, you know. And so the concerns in this period obviously are centered on that. In fact, I like to say that the first century writers, as they wrote the New Testament, it was about first things first. You do the first things first, and then you go on to the more advanced topics, which is what they're going to do in the later period. So this is this period, and we see, I sort of mark the transition of this period about the end of Paul's second missionary journey, when he's come from Corinth through Ephesus. He's coming back. He comes back to Jerusalem. That, by the way, in itself is a very interesting story. The first as well as the second time he goes to Jerusalem. But I believe something happens in his journey as he goes back out on his third missionary journey. And where does he go? Well, he retraces his steps through his first missionary journey, going through Asia Minor, but then he lands in Ephesus, and he spends 3 years in Ephesus.
Yeah.
Ephesus was very similar in stature to Alexandria in the Roman Empire. You know, they were, Alexandria might have been a little bigger, but they were both sort of number 2 and number 3 in population in the Roman Empire. And Ephesus was a place of central influence to all of Asia Minor. And since Paul had been in Asia Minor several times previously, you know, it was fitting, I think, for him to go back to Ephesus. And he founded a work there. And it was his headquarters, you might say, for preaching the gospel. And the writer Luke tells us he reached all of Asia Minor from Ephesus in this period.
Yeah.
I also happen to believe, and it's very interesting, and this would probably shock a lot of believers in the modern church, that he may have been under, not only being guided by the Spirit of God, but there's every indication that he was under a Nazarite vow during this entire period.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's an interesting story, which we won't delve into now, but I'm convinced that the entire third missionary journey, he was under that Nazarite vow. And I think there's overwhelming evidence in the book of Acts to support this.
Yeah, I think so too.
Think about what happened. Not only the Ephesus mission, Romans was written. 1st and 2nd Corinthians was written. Can you imagine? During this period, this same period.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how many believers even know what a Nazarite vow is? But those who do, you think about that. You think about that very carefully, that some of his this was almost the pinnacle of his ministry, was during this period, where he reached the most people.
Right. And
he wrote some of the most important theological works that have resonated down through history. That happened at this time.
Yeah.
At this time. And that became the transition, that third missionary journey, and particularly coming into the end. His later writings during this period, and as he's going back to Jerusalem for a second time, which is recorded in Acts chapter 21. And there's another breakpoint that occurs as he's arrested and he's imprisoned, and now he's going to Rome itself. He had not been to Rome before. He's going to Rome itself on the fourth missionary journey. It is here we begin to see a transition in his writings. And it becomes a transition, I think, for the entire New Testament, that the focus is shifting now. We're shifting out from these preliminary first things first that have to be developed and done, the groundwork laid, if you will, to now we're going to get into some deep things of God. And that happens a lot in the 60s, right on through to the end of the first century.
Perfect. And when I say perfect, it's for those of you who are learning all this stuff, it is important to know where you are in the first century. Just, what year is it approximately? Yeah. And is it post-Second Temple? And when Gary is talking about the Apostle Paul going to the synagogues, it's not that he was I mean, and in many instances, they accepted the message. But sometimes they didn't, and they kicked him out. That happens.
That's right.
And another thing is, you'll read in the book of John that they were kicked out of the synagogue. And you got to remember that the book of John isn't written until the 90s. So it's very, very late. So sometimes the chronology gets a little sketchy in people's minds, because even though it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, John isn't written until much later.
That's correct.
So you have
it's a much more, if you will, reflective gospel,
right?
Rather than just a narrative gospel. Yeah.
So it's I think it's under Gamaliel 2 that the synagogues become harsh to believers, but that's not until in the late first century.
Yes, that's correct. That's right. That's right. Yeah, by and large, synagogues were still somewhat open, and there was a lot of debate, a lot of obviously issues, but it wasn't the clampdown that you're talking about that does occur, where they're actually publicly expelled.
Yeah,
I mean, just that occurred later in the first century. So we now arrive at this critical period about 60 to 100 A.D. roughly, where we have these final writings. We have the latter epistles of Paul. We have all of John's writings. We still have Luke's Acts to be completed, because obviously he's not able to complete what was not already had happened. And so the capstone on Luke gets accomplished in the early 60s, maybe mid-60s AD. And as a result, then, it is here now that we begin to see a shift. Yes, the basic gospel message is still preached, but now it's being fleshed out. It's being filled out a little bit with very key ideas, and these ideas do touch upon very strongly the teaching of the priesthood of Melchizedek. And that's the thing that I think, if we understand that, we get a sense of the sort of the development of the text, if you will, we can better appreciate not only why and how this has happened, but we can almost see the logic of it. I mean, when Paul, as we're going to see, I believe Paul wrote Hebrews, and how does he introduce the subject of Melchizedek in Hebrews? He says, these things are mystery, you guys, and that ought not be, because you're Jewish believers. You've had the Old Testament. So what's the problem? Why is it you're not getting it? Why is it you're not taking sort of that next logical step in the process? He castigates them in chapter 5. And we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. And then goes on and then lays out the teaching on Melchizedek. So in some ways, at least the writer of Hebrews, and likely either Paul wrote it or had a very strong hand in the document, he's sharing to this community of relatively knowledgeable people, by the way, who he says in the text, go back almost to the beginning of the church. See, so not only do they have the knowledge, but they've been believers a long time, and they're not getting it. There's been a disconnect. And a lot of the book of Hebrews is to fill that gap, is to fill that void, say, okay, I'm going to make the connection for you. Of these ideas. So now we just can spend a little bit of time on what I call the big three. The big three are Peter, Paul, and John, right? And not Peter, Paul, and Mary, but Peter, Paul, and John.
Only old people are going to understand.
No, they won't know who I'm talking about.
My dad will understand it.
Yeah.
Gary, so we've got about 12, 13 minutes here.
Okay.
So I'm going to let you go and just try to introduce the idea. Then we'll have to transition for next time.
You got it. So I'll hit just the high points of this, because we will come back to looking at this further. But this is when this occurs, and I sort of mark a very pivotal, significant passage in Peter. So I'll address Peter's first, and it's in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. And I will read this because this is of such significance. And I think that Peter here really opens the door to the understanding of the Melchizedek priesthood. That's why this passage is so important. And he does it in a way that's actually quite intriguing, and we won't be able to explore it all here. But if the viewer only knew how intriguing this really was, what he says here, and maybe we'll have a chance to touch on it more later at another time. So Peter essentially announces our priestly high calling in Messiah with this passage. And it's a passage that is actually based very strongly on Exodus chapter 19. And I may read that one as well, just so that the viewer can see that connection. So the passage starting in verse 9 of 1 Peter chapter 2 says, but you, and in you here, it's very clear. The language is, he's talking to the church as a whole. He's talking to the community as a whole. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Think about that statement. I almost want to let that kind of settle in, but I know we don't have time. But I'd almost like to have a moment of silence for about a minute and just say, will you think about those words? Will you just think about those words, what those words are saying? But let me go to Exodus 19 while you're thinking and just look at verses 5 and 6 and show you something here out of this text. This is given to Israel at Mount Sinai just before God speaks forth the Ten Commandments to them. So that's the setting of this. And here's what he says. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure. You could say a chosen treasure. To me, above all people, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Almost exactly the same words that Peter is using. See? And it says two things. It says that this priesthood of which Peter speaks is kind of modeled after Israel, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it also says that Israel was given the same opportunity that he's giving to the body of Messiah. The problem is Israel chose largely, except for brief moments of periods of their history, to not walk in this calling. So God had to give them another priesthood. And yet, these things are powerful ideas. By the way, the verse 10 that Peter quotes is actually taken from Hosea chapter 1. And that's interesting on its own accord, because there the connection to the Israel is even stronger, because this is how God was speaking to Israel. You know, he calls them in Hosea, he says, you were once my people, but then you rebelled, and you now are no longer my people. But there is coming a day where once again I will choose you, and you will be my people. And it'd be fun to talk more about that at some other occasion, but this is very important. So there's this parallelism that exists between the body of Messiah today and the Israel of old. But it's a parallelism, and we have to be careful with that. You know, a lot of the mission of the church today was based upon, I believe, the original commission God was giving to Israel. They should think about that. See, that's an important idea. I also want to comment just briefly on the royal priesthood. Now, isn't that an interesting term? The royal priesthood? Mm-hmm. Well, you really couldn't apply that to the Levitical priesthood. They weren't a royal priesthood. Right. In fact, they were forbidden to be royal. Right? What's this royal priesthood? I know of only one in the Bible, the priesthood of Melchizedek. That's the only person that's ever referred to as a priest and a king, as a typology in the Bible. So we see here the beginnings then of the priesthood of the believer concept. Peter's really essentially articulating that. But that priesthood concept, Peter is telling us, it is rooted in, and he references back to the Genesis account and the proclamation of God to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
See, that's where he takes the reference point. That's where he's pointing us to. So that's Peter. That's his main contribution, by the way, to this topic. He has other things, but this is the central one. So going on to Paul. Paul introduces this concept a little bit in his latter epistles. Now, these are maybe more in the middle of his apostolic writings, books like Romans and Corinthians, Ephesians. They were written kind of in the center point of his ministry, but they're kind of coming in that transitionary period, the late 50s, early 60s, and as we're now moving into, and I think he's setting a stage here. And I was going to quote these verses. I may do that next week a little bit, but I will reference them to you today, so I can be sure to get to the end here. This sort of like what I call the temple language of Paul. Paul uses this a lot, and I'm just going to highlight just a few passages. There are more than just these passages, but these are the ones that I think have real zest and bang to them, good bang for the buck, as I like to say. They make it so clear. So this temple language is a metaphor that describes our priestly obligations and our priestly relationships one with another, and his frequent use of the members of the body to the temple itself, or to the stones of the temple, as he does in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 22. And I'll talk a little bit more about that next time. Mm-hmm. To our obligation for priestly purity, both in thought and deeds, since we are, after all, a temple for the Holy Spirit. And he does this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, and 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 to 16. And again, there are other passages, but those are ones that I would like to highlight a little bit. To our bodies as spiritual sacrifices in service to God. Romans 12, 1 to 2 is a well-known, very famous passage in this regard. Yeah. And this is just to name just a few. He begins to really draw the attention of both Gentile and Jew alike in the body of Messiah to these temple metaphors. But they're not just metaphors. There's a reality that underlies them. He talks about that. There's really a deep spiritual reality that undergirds these metaphors. And these statements are very direct, and they're very applicable to everyone. They're not just reserved for a few, for the pastors and the leaders and the deacons. No. They're for everybody to press into. This is a commission for the entire body of Messiah, just in the same way that the commission of Mount Sinai given to Israel was a commission to the entire people of Israel. There's no difference. Then in Hebrews, and we will talk about Hebrews next time, we transition into Paul, and we've talked just a moment ago a little bit about this, that I think Paul is, and we'll have to do a podcast on this. I think there's been new understanding and revelation that has emerged out of very precise analysis of the text of Hebrews that really gives insight as to who may have written it. And certainly Paul looms once again now as the leading candidate for this, or perhaps a collaborator as well. However, whatever his status, his hand is present in the book of Hebrews. And I think that's almost certain from the analysis that's been done. So I often just like to refer to him as the author in that context, but I believe that he was the author.
Yeah, I think some of our listeners would like us to do a podcast just on that, because I've got a number of questions on that one. Good.
And I'm happy to address them. So we'll do that sometime in the near future. So the idea here, of course, is Paul was just, he really delves into this subject starting in chapter 5 all the way through chapter 10. So we have about 6 chapters devoted to the Melchizedek priesthood and everything that directly connects with it. You mentioned earlier the citation, for instance, from Jeremiah 31. That, by the way, figures prominently in this discussion. What is that citation about? It's about the circumcision of the heart, isn't it? That's what it's about, right? And what is that circumcision of the heart about? Having the law written in your heart. Now, people, get a clue. What is this telling you? If the central part of this message about Melchizedek priesthood is about the circumcision of the heart, as explained by Jeremiah in chapter 31, and in that text, the central characteristic of the circumcision of the heart is that the law will be written on your heart. What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well,
is there
Gary,
meaning to that?
It means that it was the letter before, but now it's amorphous and it's nebulous and it's just whatever Jesus wants to do in my heart today.
Yeah.
But God is not inconsistent.
No, he's not.
And because we're not polytheists, we're monotheists.
Yes.
We just would think that there's utter congruence between Yeshua's law and Yahweh's law, because they're the same.
That's right.
Well,
That's
anyway,
right.
I know you'll peg that, but it just seems the illogic of it all just drives me nuts.
It is staggeringly incoherent thinking.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's incoherent thinking. It's not even, I almost want to call it thinking, you know. And by the way, I used to talk this way to my students too. And they kind of liked it. It's kind of funny. When people want to learn, they're really into learning, they don't mind being challenged. They don't even mind being taken back a little bit.
I think that's fair.
It is.
I think that's fair.
Now, if they don't want to be challenged, they don't like it very well.
Oh, yeah. They'll hate you, give you a bad evaluation, and go to somewhere that agrees with them.
But I don't care. I really don't care. Because my mission isn't to be liked. I have no interest in that whatsoever. And it's funny, as you get older, you start caring less and less about those kinds of things.
And I'm in that category. But let me tell you, there's something about tenure that just sounds so delicious.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Being honest.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So we'll go on to John, because I'll have much more to say about Paul next week. But see, this is the transition. And so it's not all that surprising that in some ways the book of Hebrews comes on the scene when it does. It's perfect. Why? The temple is about to disappear. The Levitical priesthood is about to fade away.
Yeah.
There's going to be, as I like to call it, a vacancy in the priesthood. This is going to fill that vacancy. See, so really Paul's message is very timely here. It appears on the scene about when it needed to. And I find that very interesting. So John then wraps up, and John was the apostle, I believe, of what I call the Great Transition. There was a transition to be made. Interestingly, that transition did not occur at the resurrection. This is a false doctrine. People think, oh, this big transition occurred at the... Well, go find it. Tell me where the transition was. The Jewish believers of the first 4 decades were zealous for the law. They were zealous for all of a sudden, everything they'd been learning in the Bible made sense to them for the first time.
Yep.
That was the church of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
This is what we're talking about here, you know? But the temple was going to disappear. The priesthood was going to fade away. It didn't go away instantly, by the way. There was still some priest functioning even after 70 AD, but clearly the system had taken a real hit and it was fading. And even the rabbinical rabbis of the Yavne Council in first part of the 2nd century recognized this, you know. It was fading away. So here, right at the critical juncture of history, we have the answer given to us through the book of Hebrews. That's why I find Hebrews exciting. So John will do 2 things. He will bring together the ideas and the concepts introduced both by Peter and Paul, and he himself brings to the fore in his reflections in his Gospel of John on Yeshua's ministry that help us, particularly his final teachings in John chapters 13 to 16. Oh, when you understand this, how much more meaningful those chapters become, how much clearer in understanding they become when you understand that Yeshua is giving the backdrop to the Melchizedek priesthood. What's going to be really different about this priesthood, how it's going to function, what its mission and goal, what it's all about, you know, it's sort of in there, you know.
Yeah.
And so he does that, and then the other thing he does is in the book of Revelation, he starts to draw our attention now to our ultimate goal and destiny. What this means for the believer in the day of his return, you know, and there's much to be said there, and we'll highlight some of the more significant aspects of that in the book of Revelation as well as we tie up this series, and show people that no, the writers of the New Testament understood quite well the implications from the Old Testament, and of course, as you study Revelation more and more, you realize it is hard to find a verse in the book of Revelation that is not a quote, a direct allusion, or a springboard off of an Old Testament prophet. Now think about that. People want to say, "Oh, it's all done away with." Those prophecies. Well, the Jews lost their covenant because they were disobedient. As though like we haven't been disobedient. Like we pretend like, "Oh, you mean we're not disobedient?"
Not pointing out the obvious. It's painful.
Friends, we're disobedient probably. If we're not disobedient daily, then I have to say I bow down to you and give you honor and say, okay, you're spiritual. You're really on track with God. You have one good day.
Yeah.
Our hearts, we just fall short. Let's just face it.
Yeah.
You see. So no, if it was all about obedience, we're toast. We're done. It's over.
Yeah.
Game over. It's not about that. It's about a pressing on toward obedience.
Yeah.
That's what it's about.
So Gary, is there a last second here?
Okay.
Any last things you want to fling in before I wrap it up? Or we had a good breaking point?
I'm just saying, I think I'll just summarize if I can. Take a minute to do that. Because yes, we've hit the most significant parts of this.
Okay.
To sort of prepare your audience for what's coming. In some ways, this latter time, the things that we've been talking about, the revelation of Peter, Paul, and John, they are kind of the capstone of the capstone. They really now, you have this capstone that was put on by the New Testament as a whole, and then kind of in these later writings, you now have another capstone that's put on that capstone that really points us forward to the future, and I believe the indefinite future, because we're not just talking about the kingdom as it comes in the millennial age, but we're talking beyond that. There are things happening beyond that. So John, in his position, especially being the final man standing, as I like to call him, he was probably the last of the apostles living.
Yep.
And he lived to a very old age. And he was, I think, that transitionary guy for the body of Messiah to the post-temple period, to a post-temple reality. And so his gospel is reflective. He's trying to bring out those elements of Yeshua's teachings that would be especially important and relevant to a post-temple body of Messiah. And then he knows there's going to be this vacancy. In fact, he knew it when he wrote Revelation. It was already in process. And so there was a new reality from that fact that necessitated a kind of reorientation of the body of Messiah to see itself in a new way. And in fact, it was the way that was prophesied. It was the way that really the Old Testament said, one day, this will be a reality, kind of, if nothing else, by working out the implications of what Messiah had actually accomplished. Which is why, by the way, in Hebrews, Paul is spending so much time on showing how Yeshua's sacrifice qualified him for the very role he fills now as our high priest in the heavens. Mm-hmm. See, that's why he does that. That has to be stated outright so that the body of Messiah sees that reality. And by seeing that reality, then the body of Messiah will come to a new understanding, a new vision that will take them forward for the next 2,000 years.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, Gary, thank you for your time today, as always. If you're checking with our series, the thing is, everyone, the Torah is vitally important. It is it's the blueprint of the kingdom, if you will. But it's a shadow. It's something that we walk in. Our Messiah walked in. It's something that as Gary rightly pointed out, is that we're not perfect in it, but it is certainly a right, good, righteous blueprint, and by the Spirit, we are seeking to continue to walk in that best we can. And the earning part's not there. Certainly blessing in it for sure, but the earning part's not there. And as we think through all this stuff, I think what you need to hear from me is that today was a very important transition day, even though we're not talking about the Melchizedekian priesthood proper. to couch it firstly in the context where you even understand the role of the New Testament writers themselves and what they were seeking to accomplish was a vitally important discussion, because without it, it's almost like you can't feel the weight of what they were seeking to do.
Yeah, that's very good. I like that, the weight.
Yeah,
that's a weight.
You can't feel it. Yeah. So it becomes a general non-interest in these topics in the broader evangelical community. And I know that everyone's confused about this. We know it's a big deal. We just don't know why it's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And we need to know why, because until that starts to bubble up in your heart, you can't start to run after it. Because, hey, folks, we can talk about Torah all day long, but if there is not something bubbling, regenerating, going off in your heart that wants to make you run after these things, why even have the discussion? Yeah. So let's establish these things as long as it takes. And hey, Yeshua walked in the Torah. We need to be walking in the Torah, and we want to do it every day of our lives, and that's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.
Amen.